So good morning to all. I'm very happy that you're all joining from wherever you may be right now. It's excellent to have you here in this online conference. My name is Lisa Amélie Cour. And yeah, I'm happy to discuss today what EU trade policy under the European Green Deal could actually look like in times where trade has become under increased scrutiny, and in times where climate change and biodiversity loss and other ecological problems are still accelerating dangerously. I myself am speaking to you from Paris today, but I'm usually based in Brussels, where I work for the EU office of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, the German Green political foundation that is affiliated with the Green Party represented in Germany's federal parliament. And I'm the head of the International Climate, Energy and Agriculture Policy Program. And as such, I have obviously been working on several issues around the European Green Deal. The origin of this online event is a study by the Institute for European Environmental Policy that the Heinrich-Böll Foundation commissioned last year. And its title is An EU Green Deal for Trade Policy and the Environment, Aligning Trade with Climate and Sustainable Development Objectives. And in case you haven't had a chance to read it quite yet, please feel free to check it out. I will put the link in the chat. I will not really go into further details with respect to the study because we have the lead author presenting some key findings later on. The original plan of this event was actually to launch the policy paper in March and hold an expert workshop in Brussels, but obviously things have changed, unfortunately. But I am even happier today that you're joining in and to have these online tools available to us to debate on these issues even without being physically together. And let's look on the bright side, at least more of you were even able to join from elsewhere. So let me briefly talk you over some technical details. Please make sure that your cameras are switched off because that makes the quality better, and also remain muted unless you want to ask a question later on, and we'll get back to that. We do have the possibility to have like questions and answers collected via Slido. I know who of you is familiar with that, but I kindly invite you to get connected on Slido. I will put that in the chat right now using the event code hashtag 69816. And there you can formulate your questions that you would like to address to the panelists. And you can also use the like button function to let us know that you're very interested in a question that another person has asked. And that way it pops up further on top of that list, and we will obviously take that into account when we forward questions to our panelists. You can also, if you would like to ask a question orally, raise your hand. You can do so by clicking on the participant symbol, and then you will see a little hand. And that way I can see that you're raising it, and I will give you the floor, unmute you, and also ask you to switch on your camera if you would like to do so. And that way you can interact a little more personally with our panelists. So that's for the questions and answers. We also have the normal chat function. This can be used to exchange with other participants, to share links concerning a topic that you have expertise on that's being debated. And you can also use the private chat function if you would like to contact one of the other participants of this call. Please make sure if you would like to address a link or whatever to everyone, that everyone is actually in it and not just one person. But I think I don't have to talk about these issues for too long because we have all become very familiar with Zoom by now, I would assume. Please be aware of the recording. We are recording this event in order to share it with interested people that were not able to join in, for instance, people in the United States that are now sleeping. So keep that in mind. Okay, enough about the technical details. The online event itself will now consist of a short presentation of the key findings of the IEEP policy paper that I talked about, and a subsequent panel with stakeholders and experts focusing on trade-related issues. And the objective of this exercise is to elaborate on ways forward in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to Marianne Kettunen from the IEEP, who was the lead author of that study, who will present it and also moderate the panel. She's the Principal Policy Analyst and Head of Program for Global Challenges and SDGs at IEEP, and has over 10 years of experience in issues related to the EU and international biodiversity policy. And I'm very much looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. So Marianne, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, and good morning to everybody from my side as well. So I'll be your co-pilot for this morning together with Lisa to talk about EU policy, trade policy, and where it should be going in the future to support sustainability. So as Lisa said, I'll say a few words about the study to give kind of food for thought for the panel, and then we will start the discussion first with our panel members that you've seen and I will be introducing later. And then also, basically opening the floor to questions from the audience, some reflections we have already lined up in advance to kind of start the discussion going, and then also welcoming everybody who's on the call to shoot some questions to us, to the panelists as well. So please, while you listen in, use the Slido function or use the chat to have some questions, and we'll be picking up them intermittently as well. The aim is to have enough space to have discussion, so we have a couple of hours to have and exchange views online on this. But first, indeed, as Lisa said, let's take a look at some food for thought from our study and also what is going on since the study for this event. Great. I'm hoping you are seeing my screen now. So basically, as Lisa said, we are looking at the EU Green Deal, what it promises for EU's trade policy, and what it promises particularly for the environment in this context. And let me see, can you see my screen actually moving to another slide? Not yet. Yes, now you can, right? I'm hoping you're seeing a slide which is basically called starting point for discussion. Thank you. Yeah, it seems to be a bit slow for some reason. But so the starting point for discussion for today is as follows. So when we looked at the EU's trade policy and how it's performing, basically on paper, EU's trade policy puts a great emphasis on the trade being a vehicle for sustainable development. That's been already before the Green Deal the situation. That's on paper. But in practice, it really seems that the net positive contribution of EU's trade to sustainable development has yet been achieved. So there is still certainly potential there to do better. And I think basically then what we have now towards the future in our hands is the Green Deal that gives us a new boost for the trade and environmental agenda to be combined better for sustainability. But obviously, since the Green Deal, we also have at our hands the pandemic crisis, which really throws a real kind of a curveball into the mix in terms of how trade will happen, what will happen to trade in the future. And then obviously, of course, that will interact with what we can do with trade and how we can better integrate environment into the trade in the future. And that's kind of what we will be trying to discuss today here. And our paper, which was pre-COVID era, obviously looks at this in the context of the Green Deal as things were foreseen to go before the pandemic hit us. But now we're also trying to reflect during this call today and this event today what might be the new future, the new normal when we move forward. And that's why we also asked the panelists particularly to perhaps, to help us to reflect from this perspective, because the answers aren't evident. There is a crystal ball which we'll try to look into, but whether it tells us all the answers, that might be a big question. But let's remind ourselves, what the EU Green Deal exactly says for and promises for environmental integration and sustainability in trade. So it has something for the EU's own transition, more ecological transition. It basically says that trade policy can support EU's ecological transition, so EU itself. But it also then looks at EU in a global context and says that EU should use its expertise in setting green regulations to encourage partner countries to design similar rules. So it has both the element of trade helping EU to transition to sustainability, but also EU as an active player globally to help transition to sustainability. More specifically, the Green Deal has a promise to step up the efforts to implement the trade and sustainability provisions within the trade deals, existing trade deals. It, for example, talks about the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer to be put in place to help this. And I suppose, I'm also certainly curious to know, what perhaps this particular trade enforcement officer might be doing to help this, and maybe we'll get some answers from that from our colleagues from DG Trade today. The Green Deal also puts the Paris Agreement into the spotlight, so says that it should be an essential element towards the future trade agreements particularly. The Green Deal also identifies that EU should be a driving force, or could be a driving force, for climate environmental standards globally, as said earlier, and particularly perhaps in a context of two sets of standards. One set of standards is about circularity, so EU's circular economy package, what that will bring to the EU, elevating EU's circularity standards for products, and how will that then affect the world through trade, so basically the goods that will be imported to EU. But in addition to that circularity, there's also the promise of deforestation and forest degradation-free products and value chains. So basically EU saying that we should be trying not to import products which cause deforestation or forest degradation elsewhere. So two different sets of standards, specifically a focus here, certainly. And then obviously there is also the much talked about carbon border adjustment mechanism and how that might be then obviously influencing the trade in the future that EU is looking into as a last resort, to prevent carbon leakage and prevent high carbon content products entering the market as well. So that's what the Green Deal says and promises to us. So there's quite a lot of concrete elements in the Green Deal that will hopefully help to green the trade and make it more sustainable. But then just to remind us all, so what is our policy toolbox? So what does EU have in the context of this trade policy as concrete tools to make this all happen? And the toolbox is as follows. So we obviously have the EU's trade agreements. And within those trade agreements, we have those specific trade and sustainable development provisions that are there to create the bottom line for environmental safety, basically, that trade should safeguard. And then to support the trade agreements that will be taking place, we also have sustainability impact assessments, which are the tools that look at the impacts of trade liberalization before, during the trade agreement and negotiations are taking place. So basically the evidence base underpinning the trade agreements. So those are the trade tools, as I would call them, in the trade toolbox. But in addition to that, we actually do also have what I call the non-trade tools. So tools which are not specifically trade policy, but they actually do impact trade and trade policy and are part of also the trade agreements, are referred to as well in the trade agreements. And what I mean by that is the types of regulations the EU has, like EU timber regulation or EU wildlife trade regulation or the upcoming EU conflict mineral regulation. So basically different specific sector-specific regulations that regulate what type of products EU is allowing to its market. So for example, in the context of timber regulation, EU should not be allowing to its market any timber that is illegally logged. So that's kind of very specific sector-related regulation we also have in place that can support greening of trade and be linked to and is part of the broader trade tools. So that's our toolbox at the moment. And then of course the question is, referring to what I said earlier, that we could do better based on the evidence. Why is the toolbox not really working as well as it could or should? And looking into the literature and looking into the evidence, three things come forward. So when it comes to the sustainability provisions of the three trade agreements, it seems that these are not implemented effectively enough as of yet. So people highlight that there is no proper monitoring process for those provisions. There is a lack of clear goals that would help to them to be implemented more efficiently. And particularly, there is a lack of effective mechanism to address the non-compliance when it comes to be. So an effective dispute settlement mechanism is something that people are saying is lacking. Then when it comes to the underpinning evidence, so the EU sustainability impact assessments, when one looks through those assessments, it becomes clear that environment is not treated as comprehensively and as robustly as it could be or should be. This is partly also a technical question because, it is quite technically tricky to be able to, to capture or forecast the impacts on biodiversity, for example, or forest degradation through trade liberalization. So, we can go do better through improving the methods to do so. But regardless, the situation is that, we can do better in terms of the evidence base on which we build our trade agreements on. And finally, perhaps there is maybe an untapped potential of using those tools outside the trade toolbox proper to support the trade domain. So the likes of timber regulation, wildlife trade regulation, or the conflict mineral regulation. And will be really interesting to see in the future, for example, how then the EU circular economy package and, the types, the kind of, standards that it will bring forward will have impact on trade as well. So those are some, thoughts and ideas as to why, what we could do better and, why Toolbox isn't working from the literature and also from our analysis as well. So then some food for thought in terms of the pandemic aftermath. So what we've seen immediately has, of course, been that there's been disruptions in the global supply chains and global trade because of the pandemic. This is for a number of reasons, not the least because, people can't go to work, they can't be producing things, but also, of course, because certain production lines have been directed elsewhere. But point being, we have very complex global supply chains going on at the moment, and the trade is a key element if making those supply chains, work from the world towards Europe and vice versa. And we've seen big interruptions in that supply chain. In the long term, it's been predicted that trade is expected to shrink, between 30 to 32% in 2020. So quite a, significant decrease in trade is foreseen due to the economic crisis that follows. And it's also been predicted that trade slowdown will hit the export-led countries maybe the most, and especially the primary commodities exporting countries. And we perhaps are also looking at the global south here as well as the hardest hit countries. So then the question is, what will be the response? What's the response vis-a-vis trade to all this? People can are discussing or are suspecting there can be the closing of borders, both for imports or exports. So countries will, for example, see that they're worried that they will need certain commodities themselves, so therefore they will close borders for exporting them, or they will, want to be protecting their own industry, so they will close borders for imports to their countries. So both kind of closing borders, can and has happened in the past. There's also foreseen or thought to be perhaps a push towards the deglobalization, as they call it, or higher self-sufficiency. So basically, there's a realization that, well, we are really in the mercy of these global supply chains, should be perhaps therefore not to be so, and maybe shorten the supply chains, bring the trade closer to us, and in that way, kind of not close the borders, but basically make things closer to home, bring things closer to home, which will obviously then prevent opportunities for trade and, for example, global trade. So the question then comes, what could be the response that would be something else? Particularly in the context of, the role that trade can play in the green recovery more broadly. So we as IEEP, we've been talking about what could trade for green recovery be and look like as an ideal. So that's a discussion in the EU, also in Geneva at the moment, and people are kind of trying to find, the ways to position trade to support the recovery in a green way and see, how that would play out. And hopefully, perhaps we'll be looking forward to hear thoughts on that from the panel members today, but also obviously anybody from the audience as well to share what could the green future look like and the role that trade would play in that, particularly in the COVID recovery. So for food for thought, I've highlighted a number of recommendations that come from our paper, but also some of our more recent pandemic aftermath related thinking. And this is not all our recommendations, it's a long list, kind of a shopping list, pick and choose, but I thought, I pick a few, for you to think about. So some key recommendations for the EU for future. Improving the use of sustainability impact assessments for the environment would be the first one. I strongly feel that our trade agreements can be only as good as, the supporting evidence that underpins them and also supports them, their implementation. So working on that front is one suggestion that we have. Then people are suggesting more stringent dispute settlement mechanism for the sustainable development provisions of trade. So basically, if our partner countries ourselves, if we're not complying with the sustainability clauses we set for ourselves, we should be able to hold ourselves and others responsible and accountable for that. So how to do that better? Also, there's a thought to take the sustainability provisions out of the box that they are in now. So basically in one chapter, sustainable development chapter in the trade agreements, and try to also implement them more holistically throughout the trade agreement. So for example, looking at the different sectors that trade agreement is focusing on, and already in that particular segment also looking at the bottom line for environmental sustainability, rather than only having everything in one only chapter, which kind of boxes them out and not necessarily gives the message of proper integration of environment into sectoral trade. And that's also something I'd love to hear thoughts, from the panel, from you. Would that be a possible technically to do that, and would it actually perhaps make a difference to basically have a more holistic way of looking at these things in the trade agreements? Obviously, then one thought we have is to use the implementation of the EU Circular Economy Package as an elevator of standards, sustainability standards in Europe, to also raise standards globally. So linking perhaps that also for more standards with low carbon for products, content for products. And then finally, in the global scale, particularly in the COVID aftermath, seeing whether the EU could champion adopting in the G20 context a green trade for green recovery kind of initiative, to champion that in a G20 context on a highest level of international governance. And also perhaps championing creating an independent interdisciplinary panel to support the WTO negotiations, contributing to SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So a bit of independent panel of the likes of the climate panel, the biodiversity and ecosystem services panel to support trade in the WTO context. So those are a few of our thoughts, the ways forward, and I'd love to hear thoughts from the panel and audience, also linking perhaps to these recommendations as well, whether they're realistic, whether they would be game changers or not, and also if you had to pick and choose, what do you think would be the most important one? But that's some of the food for thought from my and our side, and then of course the questions for this morning that I'll be presenting the panel with is really about how do you advance in environmental integration of EU trade policy. What will the EU trade look like in the pandemic aftermath? What are the challenges? Are there any opportunities? And indeed, how there can we ensure green trade for green recovery in the future? But with that, I think I will stop sharing my screen. And I will move on to having reflections from our panel. And also, of course, first introducing our panel to everybody on this call today. So we have lined up a very interesting panel for you to hear some thoughts from and also ask some questions from. So we have 3 DGs from the European Commission represented. We have DG Trade, we have DG Climate Action, and also DG Environment, all of them integrally involved and part of greening the EU trade, making trade more sustainable in the future. We have Anna Cavazzini from the European Parliament, and we also have a representative from the European Climate Foundation, Emmanuel as well. But moving on, first we have Niall Lawlor starting our panel from DG Trade. Niall is a policy officer, particularly focusing on environment integration into trade, and I can't really think of anybody better to kick off our panel discussion and some further food for thought in terms of what our path into greener EU trade will be. So Niall, I've asked you the question as to reflect, what would be the building on the Green Deal, what are then the key issues for DG Trade to pick up, take this really more concretely forward in the future, and obviously, of course, as well, what do you see that the COVID aftermath will do to trade? What challenges will be there for greening EU trade, and also are there any opportunities in that context as well? So Niall, over to you first to kick us off.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne. Thank you for the invitation to your colleagues. Yes, there's three of us here today, so I will primarily focus on trade aspects, but some of the kind of non-trade policies that are strongly related to trade, but then leave a lot of the Green Deal discussion to colleagues from Klima and DG Environment. To basically, in short, there's a lot in the European Green Deal communication from December, and there's even more in the communications that came out in March on circular economy, and even last week on biodiversity. So this is good timing for an event. Even though you wanted to hold it in March, this is probably better timing. We're kind of at the stage where the detailed design, a lot of it kicks off, because a lot of if you look at the annex to the Green Deal communication from last December, there's a lot of legislative proposals expected between now and the end of 2021. A lot of it's in sequence, and there's even more in the annexes to the other communications. So as I said, I will focus on the multilateral, bilateral aspects.
Yeah.
I will try to come back to your questions, but in order to say what we're planning to take forward or what concrete, I need to give a little bit of background. So to start off, I guess that the main focal area of the last 10 years for DG Trade has been, the Commission has been on bilateral trade agreements. Since the Korean agreement, we have a large number of agreements with TSD chapters on covering, so that these agreements now cover a large proportion of our trade. They cover the subjects, labor, climate, environment, these chapters. They include commitments, confirmation of commitments of partners to the international agreements to which they're party. So that the core ILO convention, international labor conventions, trade relevant MEAs, including the Paris Agreement, but also beyond the coverage and the conventions, partners have agreed a number of provisions on things that are not covered in the conventions, like illegal forestry, responsible business conduct, and on issues on important principles for us that are not ingrained in international rules, like the precautionary principle. So we have a number of negotiations ongoing, and we're expanding some of the topics, like some circular economy is now in Australia, and non-green issues like gender in Chile, which are important to other constituencies. And looking forward, as we said, as you mentioned as well, we propose to make the respect to the Paris Agreement an essential element of for future comprehensive trade agreements. Beyond the subject, the dry subject matter, on a practical level, as we mentioned in the Green Deal communication, the TST chapter also acts as a very important platform to engage with trade partners, not just with the climate environment ministries, but also with the trade industry ministries. They're often the same ministry in other countries. But also very importantly with civil society. So there's a whole infrastructure around feedback and giving, if you look at our website, we have a huge amount of joint statements, operational conclusions on issues and priorities with partners. If you look even I'm covering Ukraine, and you look at the operation conclusions on labor and forestry, they're extremely detailed and extremely concrete. And I can give you many other examples, like climate with Canada, labor with Vietnam. But you also mentioned one beyond the TSD chapter. In my previous reincarnation, I was lead on energy and raw materials. And in there we have ongoing negotiations with Australia, New Zealand, Chile, very important producers of so-called green tech raw materials. And there's a number of proposed provisions on environmental impact assessment, offshore safety, also on integration of renewable energy into grids. So these are quite far-reaching, quite interesting if you want to further explore this from your side. In the area of circular economy and in a number of our proposals or ongoing negotiations, I can't on the top of my head pick out which, but there's articles on reuse and remanufacturing of goods. So there's obviously kind of food for thought there. And we also have, you know, when we come to environmental goods, we do front load liberalization of environmental goods in our agreements. So we would argue that yes, of course, there's always, you know, possibility for more action, but there is a lot of streamlining across, especially the important areas. I don't know if you noticed as well, upon a mandate of the council last year, we put forward a position on the Energy Charter Treaty the other day. So that has an awful lot of position articles on with articles from the typical TSD chapter, but also on environmental impact assessment. So that's, you know, that's what we were asked to do by the council. So we've followed through on that, and that is another form of streamlining. In terms of assessing the impact of the FTAs, of course, you know, the SIAs are, you know, big, large undertakings, extremely in depth, and you know, they can always, there's always, with anything, there's room for improvement, and one of those areas is the in-depth treatment of biodiversity. And now I'm going to plug your work, where you, the IEEP co-hosts, they are undertaking a study for our colleagues in DG Environment on biodiversity and how it can be better incorporated in future FTA. So I understand that's going to be finished by the end of the year. So, you know, we're in your good hands, Marianne.
We're doing our best indeed there, but that's also why I said, you know, there are technical challenges there, but, you know, I think, you know, at least we are, you know, taking some right steps, which is good.
Yeah. Well, there's the issue of, you know, measuring and monitoring, but I'll come back to that in a minute.
Yeah.
There's also the pre-implementation, so things that have negotiated but not yet ratified or implemented. So we've done an awful lot of work with Vietnam, especially on the ILO issues, which has been quite successful. And, you know, I'm not in charge of any of these negotiations, but I understand that was an important part of progressing it. And this pre-implementation work will obviously remain important going forward. But to come back to your question on like what concrete initiatives, especially those mentioned in the Green Deal, and one of those is on, you know, enforcement and implementation. So, you know, we have been, as we've signed more in agreements, and we probably have less on the table, negotiations are still important, but, you know, we've obviously more and more negotiated. The focus has been more and more on enforcement. So we're like furthering our stress on implementation and enforcement. And we mentioned in December that this would be further enhanced with the appointment of a Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, which you mentioned.
Yep.
Now, the ins and outs of what the CTEO is, what we call it in shorthand. Yeah. I don't want to keep saying it's still being elaborated. It would be a high-level position in DG Trade, so it's quite important. But there's some things I can say in terms of scope and role, but limited number of things. So it would probably cover multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral, market access, as well as trade and sustainable development, but also anti-dumping, anti-circumvention, safeguard. So, and the roles, it would have probably two broad roles: to increase the efficiency of our work, so the legal breaches enforcement. There's a lot of kind of internal cuisine in terms of streamlining internal processes and, you know, coordination, et cetera, consistency, and ensuring breaches are followed up. But also the second role would be that, you know, also a communication role to tell the outside world what we're doing. And you know, the kind of public face of enforcement with the other institutions and also with stakeholders. In terms of the line between enforcement and implementation, obviously enforcement is a continuity of implementation. So the CTO would be expected to have a kind of a coordination role on the implementation, identifying, prioritizing, and, you know, promoting the agreements and helping businesses to see what they, you know, what they can and cannot do, or the opportunities. And of course, implementation and enforcement requires monitoring, and this is where I come back to the, you know, information. And you know, there's a patchwork. You know, our TSD chapters are based on a large number of MEAs, I won't talk about the ILO, the MEAs, and you've got the kind of the biological ones like CITES, biodiversity, biosafety protocol, then you've got the climate ones, and then you've got some of the chemical wastes, Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Minamata, Montreal, you know, you can go on. But they're probably the main trade relevant ones. So each one of them has rules on reporting, non-compliance procedures, non-compliance measures, dispute resolution procedures. And within that, you've got things like third-party verification and trigger, you know, it is quite different according to the different, and there's different members of each of these MEAs. So, but one of the things then is to create, you know, the knowledge on our partners and what they're doing in these different areas under these different MEAs, and what does, you know, compliance mean. And an example from last week's communication on biodiversity was that there was the Commission will create a new knowledge centre for biodiversity, and one of its duties would be to track and assess progress by the EU and but also its partners in relation to implementation of biodiversity related international instruments. So it's a matter of kind of making sure that we have all the information to hand in this process, and that obviously that monitoring information would go into the implementation and enforcement work. That's bilaterally, so I know I probably used up the best part of my 10 minutes. Multilaterally, just quickly to say, you touched that on your report. In 2016, we pushed hard for an environmental goods agreement, remain a staunch supporter of negotiations, not just on tariffs, but also that there will be an ambitious forward-looking, it will be a living agreement reacting to technology, et cetera, commitments and services. Our line has been that negotiations should be taken forward again as soon as, you know, circumstances allow, participants are ready for engaging, but, you know, the situation is that sometimes some of the partners are not ready to engage. That's obviously, you know, the still should progress, and other initiatives like promoted, I think last year by New Zealand, we're keeping a close eye on and looking at. You know, obviously we'd like to look at different options to re-engage on this link between trade and environment and multilateral trade for MC12, for the WTO MC12, whenever it happens. Probably, I think it's next year. So, you know, obviously we're very supportive of these issues, but it is given it would probably be discussed broadly over the next year. So there's not much I can say on that. I already mentioned the Energy Charter Treaty within the TSD. So that's a kind of a plurilateral quasi in between. So that's where it's at the multilateral. Obviously we're a big supporter, but it depends on, you know, the international climate.
Happens, yeah.
I don't want to take the steam out of the colleagues, and I will stay quiet soon. In terms of some of the unilateral kind of EU policy initiatives, which form the bulk of the Green Deal work, the colleagues from Environment will Climate will go into detail, but there's some that are very direct trade relevance that I mentioned. Obviously, in the area of climate, there's the well-versed proposals on CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Measure, which will have a very big, important WTO component, but I don't think I need to say more about that personally. In the area of deforestation, you mentioned the last week's biodiversity communications. In 2021, there'll be a legislative proposal and other measures to avoid or minimize the placing of products associated with deforestation, degradation on the EU market, as well as to promote forest-friendly imports and value chains. And this, and Javier will know more, it's being supported by, this was published back in February, I think, Inception impact assessments for the fitness check of the timber regulation, but also for future rules for deforestation related commodities. So there's a lot of food for thought on our website. Also in the area of waste, which is not something I've followed personally, there will be a review of EU rules on waste shipments. And last but not least, last week's biodiversity communication also signaled a new initiative on horizontal due diligence. It's in the business section of that communication, so we put forward it would be a new initiative in 2021 under the broad umbrella of sustainable corporate governance. It may take the form of a legislative proposal addressing not just environment, but also human rights, and would treat different enterprises in a proportionate way. So this is part of the work that has to be done over the next year, but it will be quite interesting work, and I think there's a lot of maybe food for thought for the rest of today's session. So I'll shut up now and let the other colleagues talk.
Thanks a lot, Niall. It's definitely good, food for thoughts. There's a lot of detail, which also makes me, hopeful and convinced as well that they are planning to take these promises from the Green Deal forward, and the steps are taken towards the direction and laid out as well towards direction. What I pick up particularly from what you said was in response to my question as to can we take sustainability provisions out of the box and mainstream or them further. You actually were saying that yes, it's also been done, and it can be done as well. So that's one thing among the many things that you highlighted. So thanks for that. I'm going to move on with the panel, but before I do that, I'm going to throw in a few questions that we've gotten from the audience to the panelists to think, and also others to think as well, and pick up if relevant, particularly since a number of them are carbon related. So might be therefore a good segue towards climate action and Elina. But we've gotten a few questions linking to trade and climate within that. So we have a question about the Paris Agreement. So asking basically, as the Paris Agreement's provisions are largely procedural, what does respecting it actually mean? So respecting it in the context of future trade agreements. Would the EU consider action in the case of not meeting NDCs? So in a nutshell, what does it mean to be respecting Paris Agreement in more concrete terms? And then there's also a question regarding the product standards to tackle carbon leakage. So has anyone or any work been done on the difficulty of measuring embodied carbon imported products? So if anybody in the audience or in the panel is aware of any such studies, they can be also highlighted in the chat, for example, or somewhere else. So few carbon related questions, not necessarily for Elina to immediately pick up, but also for the rest of the panel to think about. But as with that segue, I'm going to move on to our representative from the DG Climate Action, Elina Bardram. She is the head of unit of international relations and ready to tell us a little bit about what then our DG Climate Action's plan to implement trade-related, climate-related promises of the Green Deal in the future. So over to you, Elina.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and both Marianne and Lisa, thanks for hosting this session. I think it's very timely and pertinent. Of course, coming in the wake of yesterday's adoption of the EU's own recovery plan, it's also quite timely. We were delighted to see the Green Deal and digital confirmed as the central planks for deploying our recovery investments at the European level, and of course that will then be propelled to the international discussions that we hope to be shaping in terms of the greenness of recovery. But let me start by maybe picking up your question that came from the audience regarding the respecting of Paris Agreement. And how do you define respecting Paris Agreement? You can, of course, look at it from a level of a nation state or a party, as you would say in the agreement terms. And in the Paris Agreement, all parties have an obligation to have a nationally determined contribution at any given time. And the consequent or the subsequent NDCs need to present progression over time. So this continuous ambition increase is something that's enshrined in the Paris Agreement, as are the long-term objectives of carbon neutrality as soon as possible during the second half of the century, notably through balance between sources and sinks. So you can look at it from a kind of collective responsibility, which is for all parties, which is the spirit of Paris Agreement, pursuing all the efforts for remaining or commitment to remain within 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to remain within 1.5 degrees. So you can look at it from many different aspects, but as in terms of compliance, as the Paris construct is a bottom-up based on national determination, there are no sanctions. In fact, there are no sanctions associated in terms of any MEAs. It's more of a reputational and discretional treatment change that then would apply in this context. But we can you could write a thesis on this. So what I would suggest for my 5 minutes here is that I take us a little bit to the more helicopter level, looking at it first from the point of view of what we have been doing traditionally before this current college, and then what the Green Deal has meant for our trade and climate cooperation. And finally, to offer a few initial reflections about, okay, what's the post-COVID recovery going to mean in this context? And if I start from kind of the traditional cooperation that we have had between DG Climate and DG Trade, we have of course been from DG Climate participating in the negotiations, bilateral negotiations on the trade and sustainable development chapters. And as we achieved the Paris Agreement, as that was ratified, it became a very kind of concrete and tangible part of these trade negotiations. So there's mutual commitment to implementing Paris Agreement that's very clearly written in all the post-Paris Agreement FTAs. And even in the case of Canada, where the CETA agreement was agreed prior to Paris Agreement, we have added an addendum that stipulates this mutual commitment to Paris implementation. In addition to this, of course, we have been pursuing sustainable trade practices to trade-related assistance, which is something that has become increasingly pertinent, particularly in Africa. And the climate component, sustainability aspects are mainstreamed in the trade-related assistance. And I think that's something that will be further pursued as we move on with the implementation of Green Deal. The other side of our kind of trade shaping measures is, of course, the different regulations and standards that we have implemented in the EU that have really shaped, for instance, the automobile industry around the world. Our CO2 standards in cars, our support to electromobility has significantly altered the way investment in automobile sector is decided upon, as the EU still represents a huge market for exports from countries such as China, Korea, and the US. And by the virtue of having to revisit their production model, also these good standards have been taken up domestically. So I think there are many positive contributions that have been done. At the same time, I agree, TSD chapters, they're not always the most lively ones. We have joint committees, we meet, we agree on high principles. And with the Green Deal, we have really wanted to look at the more operational aspects. And we have, for instance, in the context of CETA, been able to convene dedicated workshops between Canada and the EU to bring together stakeholders that are interested in accelerating low carbon transformation. And this has provided a powerful platform for sharing experiences, but also establishing networks between industry. And I think this is something that we will want to examine further as the Green Deal moves on. That has all been kind of before the Green Deal even manifested itself. And in the context of Green Deal, of course, you already quoted the relevant references to trade as a measure. The Green Deal also has the inclusion of the border measures. So in the absence of comparative efforts or absence of climate ambition by our partners, the EU is ready to consider carbon border measures in order to ensure that carbon leakage doesn't happen from European industry, and that we don't, actually by introducing more stringent measures in the EU context, that we don't, see leakage of our industries elsewhere, which would then in turn result in net increase in CO2 emissions. This is of course something that we need to design with care. The technical and legal aspects of it have to be assessed, and I think at the current planning we have the border measures proposal foreseen for 2021 summer or second half. What's key for us is that when we go out with something as significant as a border measure, that it is bulletproof and that it stands to all legal challenges, because we would not want to upset the already complicated trade conversations which we will be seeing in the post-COVID world. Now, the Green Deal also, of course, means that when we, have increased our climate ambitions significantly, and the climate neutrality efforts within EU will be accelerated, that will reshape the trade patterns and the trade balance. So there is expectations for us to become much less dependent on imported fossil fuels, as those will be substituted by more indigenous renewable energy sources, which is something that's often referred to as strategic autonomy. So we'll become less dependent on imported fossil fuels from at times volatile regions and the imports from rogue governments. We also expect that as the low carbon industry really picks up further in the EU, there will be more demand, on the other hand, for raw materials required for low carbon technologies, such as rare earths, different components of electric vehicles, and the likes. So there will be shifts in demand of imports, but also in the way we approach our partnerships. What we want to ensure, of course, and this is something that the EU is a strong defender of, is a rules-based multilateral order, which allows fair access by all to those very precious rare earths and the other raw materials required for increasing the low carbon investments. Now, maybe then going quickly to the post-COVID situation. The recovery package that's been put forward by the Commission, and of course at this point it's only the Commission's proposal, sees the next generation package of 750 billion, out of which 500 billion would be issued as grants and 250 would be in the form of loans. In spending the member state specific, or in dispersing the member state specific support, the EU will be looking at the national energy and climate plans, the integrated plans that are intended to stipulate how the member state will reach its 2030 target. And of course, the recovery plan also confirms that we will be coming forward with our proposal to increase the 2030 target at EU level still during this year, which will again bring a new impetus for accelerating action. So while trade policies is not a policy driver for climate action, it's certainly a policy enabler. We will need this increased access to the materials, and we will hopefully lessen our dependency, as we will need to rethink our supply chains. One of the things that the COVID crisis has exposed is our vulnerability as many of our own industries depend on components that are produced elsewhere in the world, and those supply chains have of course been disrupted. Circular economies is going to be a vital part of our efforts in this regard. At the moment, some 12% of EU industrial raw material or materials is recycled. We intend to increase that manifold, and that too will lessen our dependency on exports from outside countries and continents. So there's a lot in place. On the final note, I'd like to say that as Green Deal stipulates, our first and foremost efforts will be placed on inducing ambition and action by our partners. Here, indeed, I think we have potential to look at the FTA chapters beyond TSD, looking at standards, regulations, public procurement rules. Could we align our approaches in this respect? And we will be hoping to enhance our regulatory cooperation in other areas as well, because this type of convergence is precisely what we would need in order to avoid ever having to take the border measures in action. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Elina. I think I'll, of the rich sort of, food for thought that you provided, and also, actions taking place, and, your plans and hopes and dreams for future. One thing I picked up was, you mentioning the automobile sector and the regulatory, basically what, EU's elevation of standards in the EU already there did for elevation of standards also more broadly in the world. That's kind of just, to highlight that as an example. It has been done before, or it hasn't happened before, so it can also happen in the future as well. So that's the kind of the way and the mechanism through which EU and EU's trade on different sectors can actually help also globally to elevate the sustainability standards. Before I move on to Javier, to DG Environment, I'm just going to highlight that there are a number of questions popping up on Slido side, linking to reflecting basically, Elina, what Elina has said, and also what Niall has said, particularly carbon related. So Lisa, can you just put the Slido link again on the chat maybe, and then perhaps for example, while listening in, Elina and also Neil can take a look at those questions as well and see if there's answers to them towards the more discussion part a bit later as well. So just saying that, we are looking into those questions that the audience has been sending, and also trying to take them up and, draw attention from our panelists to those as well. But now moving on to Javier Arribas Quintana, who is a senior expert from DG Environment, specifically focusing on environmental integration into trade policy. So Javier, I think your colleagues have outlined, a number of issues already, but I guess, we'd love to perhaps hear from you then specifically maybe on the circular economy side, on the biodiversity side, so more really kind of these certain sectoral policy dossiers and how they can be taken forward in trade. So over to you, some thoughts and reflections, please.
Thank you, Marianne, and good morning, everybody. And I hope everybody's healthy and in good form this morning, and you are somehow enjoying the spring weather wherever you are. We have gorgeous weather here in Brussels. Thank you, the organizers, for this online event, which is indeed very timely and topical. Trade and sustainability is more than ever an issue of fashion, and indeed a number of very interesting and important policy decisions and documents have been adopted in the very recent past. Last week, strategies that have been mentioned, biodiversity, farm to fork, recently also in March, circular economy, and yesterday, more recently, the recovery plan by the Commission. So there are plenty of things to think about it. And the risk here is that we are a little bit out of date, not completely up to date. I have the advantage of disadvantage of speaking third after my previous two colleagues. So this in a way obliges me to focus on things they have not mentioned, which is going to be difficult because they have mentioned a lot.
Yeah.
I want to thank you also, Marianne, and I mean the authors of the report and the presentation you made. you touch upon a number of recommendations, which actually they are very valid and very much welcome. And actually, we are already following some of them. I mean, you mentioned one that I particularly like, which is the unboxing TSD from the TSD chapter in FTAs. I like that expression, and put it into a more horizontal way all throughout the FTAs, and I think that's a very good path to follow. And we in DG Environment, we are of the same view, that actually sustainability should be across the board issue, which should feature all through the FTAs. The questions you asked, Marianne, and I suspect the questions that are coming in through Slido are indeed very much interrelated to what I'm going to say and with what has been said by my colleague Niall and Elina. But I don't want to overlap too much, and I will try to address basically two specific aspects more in detail. First, by way of framing, I want to say that currently both globalization and international trade are concepts which are somehow in disrepute. Even though it's true that most people will recognize that their everyday life would be extremely difficult without them. But what is out of question is that for most people, I mean, I would say for everybody, it's clear that if we continue in business as usual mode, we will soon run out of planet. And the planet is limited, therefore we have to do something. So the question is, what can we do about it? Autarky is certainly an option, but this will bring us to the night of times, so we better leave this option aside for the moment. Perhaps more reasonable and certainly easier to achieve is to have a positive agenda for responsible and sustainable economic growth model, including trade, right? The thing is that we have all the policy elements at our disposal to achieve that goal, and actually the roadmap is very clear. We have it there, the Agenda 2030, and its 17, I believe, Sustainable Development Goals are showing the way to the entire world. So why don't we just do it, right? The post-COVID recovery crisis gives indeed an extra incentive to do that, and bring us a window of opportunity with a build back better perspective, a kind of a second chance, perhaps the last one. So I think we better take it this time. As I said, many things have already said by my colleagues, so I will concentrate in two: circular economy action plan and the biodiversity strategy. On the circular economy, just framing the issue, the worldwide transformation to a circular economy basically entails moving from linear, highly resource depleting systems with high emissions and a lot of waste generation and high impact on ecosystems and natural capital, which is actually the model we are basically today, towards something completely different, or not completely, quite substantially different. More circular, less wasteful systems that use resources more efficiently and sustainably, while at the same time providing work opportunities and a high quality of life. This is a key contribution to the 2030 agenda, and indeed the circular economy and the underlying concept, sustainable consumption and production, basically is at the origin of a number of SDGs. Reducing the consumption footprint and increasing the circular material use rate is, as you know, a particular priority. for us, which is also seen in the context of the European Green, in the context of the European Green Deal. Also, it's an issue which relates to the strategic access to resources, which is a strategic security consideration for the EU. Natural resources underpin national economies, provide crucial raw materials for everyday life, and are necessary to almost every sector in the global economy. And given the size of the demand, raw materials, including primary and raw materials, obtained by recycling, for instance, will continue to play a major role in the global economy. So this is something we cannot ignore, and especially if we are to redesign a well-functioning economic/trade system post-crisis. The problem is that the EU cannot deliver alone the ambition of the European Green Deal for a climate-neutral, resource-efficient and circular economy. The new Circular Economy Action Plan, which was adopted, as you know, in March, the 10th of March, I believe, made clear that fact. And therefore, the action plan makes a call for the EU to continue leading the way to a circular economy at the global level and use its influence and expertise and financial resources to implement the 2030 agenda. The EU's green diplomacy efforts and its goal and its global soft power provide major prospects for promoting key circular economy policies. And we are promoting that through various number of methods and approaches and tools, starting by all the policy dialogues that we have, the trade relationships, technical and financial assistance that we provide to countries. We try to align with the EU circular economy norms and standards, product policy. We have discussions in the context of global institutions, WTO, OECD, and the various subcommittee meetings that deal with these issues on trade and environment. I've been recently attending some of them in the, for instance, Committee Trade and Environment of the WTO. In November, there was a very rich discussion on all these issues. Circular economy was at the core, and issues related to plastics and things like that came to the fore, and there was a huge interest and a lot of engagement by participants. Same in the OECD in February, a huge event also. The Joint Working Party of Trade and Environment organized a similar event, and again, the reception and the participation was huge and very interesting debates. So this proves actually that all these issues are in a way taking ground on the wider trade and environment community, and this is very good. I mean, we started the battle a few years ago. We were basically alone, but now I believe we are not anymore, and this is good news. I also myself participated at UNEA, the UN Environment Programme, in March 2019. Core business of that UNEA was sustainable consumption and production, and there, same thing, big debate. All the actors involved and increasingly taking seriously these issues, and circular economy being at the core of all these issues. And a number of resolutions were adopted in that respect.
Javier, can I just before, because that's in the circular economy covered. So and you said also you maybe would touch upon a little bit of deforestation and biodiversity. Maybe next, moving on to next. I just I picked up a question from the audience, which I thought I'll just feed in through here, which you might or might not be able to to reflect or answer, but maybe. Maybe yes. So basically, there's a question whether the post-COVID environment, in the post-COVID environment, has the health been factored into the Green Deal? So the links between biodiversity loss and the zoonotic diseases and the leading of the pandemic. So that kind of in the whole chain of thinking obviously links to the deforestation. That's kind of where I'm going with this. So any any reflections on this regard, how this has been maybe, picked up by DG Environment, biodiversity strategy perhaps as well, and is there any links been so far made with what's happening with the COVID risk, or the way things played out towards the COVID and the risk, and bringing that also in the trade scene? So if there's anything you can comment in that regard, I thought I'm going to throw it in here before you're going to reflect something on the biodiversity and deforestation as well.
You want me to answer that question already now, or should I first mention the main action?
Just mention first the main action plan, and then also think if there's something you can link to this link to this question.
No, I just wanted to say 2 words on the main key actions of the circular economy action plan, which relates to trade, and in particularly the efforts that we will lead at international level to reach a global agreement on plastics. As you know, plastics has been a very topical issue, and it's an omnipresent and hugely traded commodity. And a number of initiatives have been undertaken, but not in a holistic way. There are UN efforts dealing with marine litter and microplastics, marine pollution. There have been a number of UN resolutions in that regard. The Basel Convention, which was mentioned by Niall, the WTO also initiatives. China was very keen to start something on plastics and still is, but there is no a holistic approach to that, and I think we in the Commission, in the environment, we certainly will continue taking the lead to mature the debate towards that global agreement on plastics, and this is foreseen in the action plan. Global Circular Economy Alliance, this is something which is announced by the action plan. Again, the idea is basically to identify knowledge and governance gaps, and we've been in talks already with UNEP to perhaps take the lead on the forming of that alliance. We will be very keen to gather and to federate interest and action around the world on this alliance. In the same vein, we are trying to explore the feasibility of defining what we call safe operating space. This is not a new concept. The IRP has been using this concept a lot in the past. And the idea here being that we should set our planetary boundaries, the limits of where we stand on the main resources: water, soil, land, minerals, metal, biomass, and see what are the limits we should not trespass in order to make sure that we don't put into question our well-being and the well-being of future generations. This is something we will have to be working in the future. And related to that, we are considering possibility to an international agreement on the management of natural resources. We are doing a number of other things, outreach, also partnership in, setting partnerships with key countries and continents, in particular Western Balkans and Africa too, and we will continue to promote. Yeah.
Alex, se olisi pelkkää jamia koko päivän, mä en oikein ole samaa.
Sorry. On free trade agreements, I would not say much because this has been touched upon Niall. Just to say that circular economy is part of those, and in particular in the last generation of FTAs, we are very keen in having more ambitious circular economy language. And for instance, with countries like New Zealand, we are going basically in that direction.
So I think are you moving on to thinking of biodiversity and deforestation next?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Biodiversity, you've seen the study which was adopted a few days ago. We see the biodiversity as a central element of the EU recovery plan. Also, it's crucial to preventing and building resilience to future outbreaks and providing immediate business and investment opportunities for restoring the EU economy, not only because of the huge costs which will run in that we will run in the case of inaction, which will be huge, but also because nature restoration actually provides immediate business and investment opportunities for restoring the EU economy, in particular in a number of sectors. Just to mention construction, agriculture, of course, and food and drink. These sectors are highly dependent on nature and they generate huge amounts of money. And the benefits of biodiversity conservation for the economy are huge. That's no question about it.
Wonder how we either been lost Javier, or he's having a thought.
No, I'm trying to synthesize what are the key message here. But I mean, since you mentioned deforestation has been an issue that we've been thinking about for a long time, well before the COVID crisis. We had a number of communications in the past, and the most recently in July, where we set up already the path of action, and there we already announced a number of measures that we will undertake. Not the least to mention the one that you have mentioned, and it was mentioned by Niall, which we believe is key. We want to reduce the environment footprint of our consumption patterns, in particular when it comes to the impact that these consumption patterns has on countries exporting forestry goods. So we are currently carrying on an impact assessment in that regard, and we will come forward with a proposal probably in the first quarter or second quarter of next year. So this is something which is an important element of the whole deforestation policy.
Great. And Javier, I think I'm going to thinking of the time as well. You know, if you don't mind, we can pause here and then maybe come back to the questions as well. Further reflections on that. So making sure that we also have the remaining panelists to be able to to reflect. If that's well okay by you. So super. And then again, take a look at the questions that the panelists have been already plenty of them coming in through Slido. Before I move on to next speaker on the panel, we're going to move from the Commission to the European Parliament, and we should have Anna Cavazzini online, who is an MEP, Group of Greens, and most importantly for this particular topic of the day, member of the Committee on International Trade. Anna, great to have you here. Loving to hear from the European Parliament perspective, hopes and wishes for future EU green trade deals. I know you're very active on this also on social media as well. So thoughts from your side, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne, and thanks, Lisa, for organizing this event and also for publishing this important study. I really think this discussion on how to green the external dimension of the EU economic policy and how to bring more sustainability in the trade policy is really, really crucial and important. And I have read all of your proposals with great interest, and I think it's good to discuss them today. I wanted to remind all of us why it's so important that we talk about trade policy and sustainability. Trade rules really, really shape our economy, and they are hard to change. Like once they're there, they're really above basically national legislation, national and European legislation to really implement the international trade rules. and if they're once there, it's hard to change. So for the next decades, we often decide in those FTAs and international trade agreements how our international economy looks like, and this is why this discussion is so important. I was supposed to talk about what the INTA, the Trade Committee, is discussing, and I can just tell you that the INTA is, as you can imagine, not united on the question. There is, of course, some people saying that trade is trade and sustainability doesn't really have to play a role in that, or basically, yeah, concentrating everything on the TST chapter, saying, yeah, we have the TST chapters. It's basically enough because the Paris Agreement and human rights and social standards are already enshrined in our trade agreements, and this is basically enough. Me and a lot of others say it's not enough, and this is of course really part of the debate we're having basically every week in the Trade Committee, but I guess not only in the Trade Committee, also in the Council. If you look at the non-paper that was published by the Dutch and the French government, who also tried to spur a debate in the Council, so I guess it's good that in the Parliament, in the Council, and hopefully also in the Commission, discussions are going on. I would say it is really important to look at the TSD chapters, and you also made some suggestions in your study how to improve the enforcement, because we see that the TSD chapter, as they are designed at the moment, really don't work so well. There's only one case at the moment where we kind of really look into some measures, that is South Korea, but there have been a lot of trade agreements in place where there have been violations of the standards in the TST chapter when nothing has happened. For example, looking at the Peru-Colombia trade agreement, but many, many others. So one important thing is really increasing the enforceability of TSG chapters, but this is clearly not the only thing, because I think the structure of the trade agreement itself has to really change, and has to be to change the sustainability standards. I think one very interesting example is indeed the mandate for the UK negotiations, because we see for the first time that the Paris Agreement is anchored as an essential element, and that also some very concrete provisions on implementing the Paris Agreement are, or like at least in the mandate, proposed to be in the entire agreement. For example, joining the European Emissions Trading Scheme or implementing a similar scheme. And this is also something that we Greens are proposing, that only mentioning the Paris Agreement in the TST chapter is not enough. We really need to have obligations in, and also kind of a sanctions-based system, that if a party is not reducing its CO2 emissions, or is not really implementing a national policy framework that is correspondent with the Paris Agreement, that there could also be a removal of some of the trade preferences. Then we also suggest differentiating a little bit more the products we are trading towards sustainability. For example, really trying to increase basically tariffs and make it a little bit more difficult to trade with goods that are very, very damaging for the climate. And on the other hand, of course, try to lift tariffs and obstacles much more in products which are sustainable. So differentiating a little bit what we are discussing. And thirdly, I think it is very important to also look at the rules that do harm or that prevent states from implementing climate policy, because some of the rules and trade agreements really also hamper a very progressive national environment and climate policy. So I think it is also worth looking at what kind of rules we don't have to have in FTAs, or where we need carve-outs for creating more national policy space and implementing progressive climate policies. Deforestation was mentioned already. I mean, I'm working a lot on the Mercosur trade agreement. We see that already in the past, the trade with soy really led to huge deforestation rates in the Amazon region. There's a lot of studies that show that trade really that contributes to 1/6 or more to deforestation in the world. Yeah, soy, palm oil, etc., etc. So I think it is really important to get rules in place that not only take care of illegal timber, illegal logging. This is important, but much more on the land use change, and integrate also this in trade agreements. And in the case of Brazil, we have to really reducing the soy imports from Brazil. But of course, when you look at the Mercosur agreement, we see forecasts of increased agricultural exports from Brazil or from Argentina, beef, ethanol, poultry, etc., that will increase definitely the pressure on the Amazon region, without, on the other hand, having a really binding, enforceable mechanism of how to deal with breaches of environmental policy in Brazil, for example. So we say, when you look at these very specific trade agreements at the moment being negotiated, this would be exactly the wrong direction to take, because we talked a lot about theory today and general policy proposals, but I also really wanted to point to the fact that there are a lot of agreements being negotiated at the moment that don't adhere to Green Deal standards, in my mind, and to climate standards, and we have to see what happens to them. One other aspect was mentioned already, what is very important, and we as Greens are fighting for that for a long time together with other groups, is of course mandatory due diligence. I mean, this has nothing directly to do with bilateral free trade agreements. It will be a European legislative initiative to reform corporate law. And we are very happy that the Commission, or Commissioner Reinders, already like 3 weeks ago in our event, organized by some parliamentarians, proposed a legislative initiative for next year. This is a very big step forward to my mind, trying to ensure that human rights and environmental standards are kept throughout the entire supply chain. So this is a very important step forward, but I think in the other areas that I mentioned, for me, the policy at the moment is far too much business as usual. And I think it is too late if we only start reforming the future trade agreements, because we are already negotiating with the entire world right now. I mentioned Mercosur, Mexico, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, so many trade agreements. And if we don't start changing already now our policy, I mentioned at the beginning how much they shape our economy, it will be too late in my mind. Probably the last 2 ideas before I stop. I think it would be also in general important to measure the impact of CO2 emissions by trade liberalization. I mean, the Commission does already this yearly, I think it's a yearly report on the state of trade and of the trade agreements, and I think it would be really important to incorporate also a section on really measuring the impact of new FTAs on CO2 emissions, because I think we don't have so much data on that. And lastly, of course, I would find it very, very important to, this is not surprising, give the European Parliament a bigger say in the shaping of FTAs, because at the moment we can only say yes or no at the end. And I think it would be really, really important that the European Parliament also has a say on the mandate, because then we can really from the beginning say and discuss what we want to have in an FTA that is then being negotiated for several years. And then at the end, it's really too late to change something, or this is often the argument. So I think it would be important to really have a more democratic step forward in trade policy as well, and giving the Parliament the power of co-deciding on the mandate together with the Council. I'll stop here, but I'm happy to also take questions and debate with you. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Anna. Thanks a lot for that. Before we move on to our last panelist, I'm going to bring a few questions linking to what you said, Anna, from the audience. So I think they're quite well aligned, what you've been saying. So there's a kind of comment or question in the audience. Again, we talk quite a lot about Paris Agreement and the climate-related provisions. So about making the Paris Agreement an essential element of the EU FTAs, what would that mean for the enforcement? Would an additional enforcement mechanism be created? Is a question. I think I kind of get from what you said, Anna, that from your perspective, you were kind of alluding to that. We will need more enforcement to be able to work better with what we have, not only looking into the future agreements where we will be doing this. Another comment, a question as well, is about the feasibility of the French and the Dutch proposal that came out a week or so ago on trade and climate, and the idea of conditioning the tariff liberalization on trade on attainment of climate objectives by partners. So, any thoughts or comments on that? But again, we are really in the space of how can we regulate as the EU better, make sure we will be enforcing the Paris Agreement provisions and the climate-related provisions, working with what we have at the moment, and perhaps also under the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So those questions, we'll see if we will be having the time to actually to address them, but at least they have been now put forward by the audience to the thinking hats of our panelists as well. But with that, final panelist, last but certainly not least, Emmanuel Guerin, who is the Executive Director for International Group of the European Climate Foundation. And the reason why we invite Emmanuel to be part of the panel as well is to reflect at large, working together with the civil society, also providing support to civil society to work on these topics, collecting some thoughts in terms of, the possibilities, opportunities and threats as well in terms of concerns and wishes, where the EU trade should go next in terms of sustainability. So Emmanuel, some thoughts from your side as a final panel member.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this very interesting panel. I must say, and congratulations to you and other colleagues and partners on this project, trade and the environment, trade and climate more specifically. It's a very difficult topic, but you're doing it very well. I'll be very brief because I'd like to concentrate on what I consider to be truly essential in this debate, as opposed to the many details that also need to be addressed. And I'll first concentrate on your Marianne, and then react and debate with the previous panelists in the hope as well that we can discuss with the other participants. To your first question about civil society, and I'll certainly not claim that we represent civil society at large, even less that we support all of civil society. But what we're seeing in supporting many different partners in Europe on the trade and the environment, think tanks like you, NGOs, activists, lawyers, many of them use different tactics, is I think that even if you rightly said at the beginning, and that's very much you. Oh, it said that I was muted by the host. Can you still?
I was trying to mute myself, and I accidentally muted you. So please don't take it personally. It was my lapse.
No worries. No worries. If trade and trade agreements in particular can be a tool for greening the economy, achieving sustainable development, and that's very much a view we have at the European Climate Foundation. Partners we support. I think civil society organizations often have, and rightly so, I would say, a worry that trade agreements are in practice. Whether it is intentional or not, that's not really clear. The effect of weakening the environmental regulations in Europe as opposed to being conceived as a tool for a race to the top. And unfortunately, we've got many examples of that. I think this is a trend that is amplified by what Anna said, which is the way in which these agreements are negotiated. Unlike mental agreements, and in fact, unlike many other international agreements, which certainly doesn't help civil a constructive role. Let me put it like this, because when you're presented with a binary option of saying yes or no at the end of a process, you are by definition putting people into a bit of a radical position. So we would see a much more honest and constructive debate with civil society, the rules of discussing and negotiating these agreements was implemented. Second, I think that worry is amplified by the fact that the lion's share of the new trade agreements are bilateral and regional and not multilateral. And this is a very difficult challenge for civil society. It means that as opposed to being a centralized battlefield in Geneva around the WTO, this is a very, very decentralized one, and you need to watch all the bilateral and regional agreements that are being negotiated without necessarily capacity to do this. So that's the two things I wanted to say in response to your question on civil society. Then the main point I'd like to make in this debate, having heard the previous participants and also very much taking in account the current context of the COVID crisis, the recovery from it, and the, I thought, very bold and very welcome announcement that made by the President of the Commission yesterday. It's a point that will not surprise you around the border tax adjustment. Not necessarily because I think this is the most important tool in the books that we have, but this is certainly the most sensitive, as pointed out by previous speakers, and there is also potentially a lot of misunderstandings around it, lead to counterproductive outcomes from an economic, environmental, and social perspective. And the point I'd like to make, I very much agree, by the way, with Evelina, that it's very important to have the policy design of the instrument right, because you need to make sure that it stands the test and a likely attack by those who will have to play by the rules of that instrument if it was to be implemented. But even more important than the policy design, in my view, is politics and the geopolitics and how it is played by the European Union. And to be clear, I am a supporter of the concept of a border tax adjustment because I think this is what tools Europe has within its toolbox to achieve what is its top political priority, and rightly so, and that's the Green Deal. But it's important to put the priority first, achievement of the green, in particular, zero greenhouse gases emissions by 2050. And then to think about how to align policy instruments with the political priority. And I think if you do it like that, you realize that it's impossible for the EU to put it in place unilaterally. And I think the EU should very much learn from its mistakes, and in particular, the attempt at including international aviation within the emission trading scheme. We know what happened after that. And the outcome was not highly bad, by the way, because it led to a breaking of the deadlock within the ICAO. The discussions have been much more positive since then. But I don't think we really have that as a possibility in front of us, and I think we can achieve much better. And at the risk of being a bit provocative, I would argue that Europe needs to discuss the implementation of a border tax adjustment with China first. And there is a very good political opportunity for doing it, which is the Leipzig EU-China summit. And I think, the threat of the border tax adjustment is definitely a trigger for climate action in China, but I would go one step further, and I would put it in the context of a deal, of a bargain in between Europe and China first, before building a larger coalition of countries, saying, well, if the EU and China increase their nationally determined contributions to 2030 in the context of the agreement, then there is no reason why the European border adjustment should penalize China and other countries that follow the spirit, as well as the letter of the Paris Agreement, and in line with objective and time frame, revise by the time of COP26 their nationally determined contribution. So that's the proposal that I have on the table, and I'll just summarize by saying, for me, even more important again than the policy design of the border tax adjustment is the politics, the geopolitics. If we don't want it to trigger a trade war, which would not only be negative from an economic point of view, but also from an environment point of view, we need to conceive this very important move and tool in support of the European Green Deal cooperatively, and not as a unilateral measure that otherwise would, definition, and rightly so, be interpreted as a protectionist measure. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Also, for some, mildly provocative thoughts, I think, we do need to, put these out there in the open, and then just, see, what the response is, and what others think as well. Looking at the time, first of all, thanking all our panelists for very rich interventions. There certainly has been plenty of food for thought, and also really concrete actions and thoughts, what to do next from the Commission to the European Parliament, but also from now from Emmanuel. What I'm thinking to do is plugging up for Emmanuel highlighted the importance of multilateralism. I think that was one of the things that he was really came across from what you said. So there are questions linking to that. From Caroline, from our colleague Karen from Geneva, and she's asking, could we hear more about EU's multilateral trade vision strategy for advancing environmental sustainability and concrete action on climate SDGs at the WTO? That might be, a question towards, Neil, to your camp. So if you're still there, I hope you're still there. Maybe you can reflect that a little bit, and I'll give you some time to reflect, picking up a few questions from the audience, which I don't think we have perhaps time to go into anymore, but I think there kind of are, there's some questions which are kind of in a similar vein. So just putting it out there for future discussions that we hopefully will be having as a community or bilaterally. But one question is about the role that consuming less in the first place should play in the trade debates and policies in the future. So the whole idea of, really looking at also our consumption patterns, how should that be played into in the trade debates? And is the current crisis an opportunity in this regard? So that's a good, bigger horizontal question in this space. And also a reflection and question from the audience saying that, the proposals by the Commission seem about more adding sustainability to deals in the future, but not to remove provisions in deals that have negative impacts in the first place. So, how to change that. So we have things in place which are, are having negative impacts. Can we also, do some removal in addition to while doing some adding up? So that's also one more broader question that we have. But with those thoughts, from Carolyn, from the multilateral side, towards Neil, you maybe reflect, so EU's plans, WTO, multilateralism, where could we go from there?
Marianne, you wanted me? Questions. Are they?
Yeah, the questions about EU's plans in WTO and basically supporting taking these issues forward in the WTO context, sustainability and environment more broadly. So specifically that.
Okay, so there's not much I can say here. Unfortunately, there was the MC12 that was planned for this summer, and then that was postponed till next year. We do have a trade strategy that was, it's been in the making, but it's been indicated yesterday that it would be the end of the year, and then there would be, part of that would be a discussion on WTO reform. And I would imagine that a part of that would relate to sustainability. Now, there are, various groups within the WTO called, Friends of Sustainable Trade, FAST, or, and it's a matter of discussing, but it's definitely the postponement of the MC12 has definitely taken the edge off some of that discussion. And it's really about the next few months in terms of this trade strategy. But I am not, in my current position, actively involved in that. That is a broader discussion. So there's not much I can say, but just to read the documents that came out as part of the response to the crisis yesterday, and for stakeholders to actually come forward with ideas over the next few months. But just to reiterate what I said, our position with regards to these sort of discussions like EGA, we remain very much a staunch supporter of these issues. So our position has not changed. So it's very much as was. Yeah. So it's very much more to do with other dynamics. I'm sorry I can't give you a more.
No, that's already good, and I think that's a good reflection. And what I'd like to do next is actually to give the floor for a brief moment to Carolyn. So colleague Carolyn Deer-Burbeck, who is a senior researcher from the Graduate Institute of Geneva, and knows quite well what's going on in Geneva and WTO. So Carolyn, I've asked you to listen carefully and also perhaps reflect a little bit what you hear from the EU side, and say, how that links with what you've also now currently hearing and being part of discussions in the Geneva side as well, in the hub of the multilateralism WTO discussions. So some, quick reflections from your side, how does what we are saying here more in the EU context also map against, what the discussions are in Geneva?
Great. Thank you very much, Marianne, for the opportunity. A really great discussion. I think just as there's only a very few minutes, I'd like to pick up on one of the points that Emmanuel made, is that we need to think about the geopolitics or the broader context in which we're trying to advance the EU's trade policy agenda on the Green New Deal, because ultimately, the EU will need to bring other countries in the world on board. And the question is how best to do that. And I appreciate, that we need to start, domestically or regionally with that, but I think it's really critical to think how they can move forward in the multilateral arena in a way that builds understanding and shared action on these issues. So one of the issues that's underway in Geneva is this push for a ministerial statement on environmental sustainability and trade, which many countries still are interested in advancing, and I think that that will still be a deliverable. There's still an intention that that will be a deliverable for MC12, and the EU is part of the FAST group, but we would need them to be actively engaged to bring developing countries on board. And so part of that is thinking about how the EU presents its work on climate and the Green New Deal to other member states at the WTO, and build bridges or ways of building understanding in that context, because there is a lot of apprehension about the EU's agenda in that respect. But I also think, and this is really critical, that there are a lot of potential allies. The scene has changed from the old sort of north-south one. There are many developing countries that consider themselves allies of a sustainability agenda. I think specifically on climate action, especially LDCs and SIDS, who are those in the front line of climate impacts, that they get trade shocks related to those. There's a huge issue, economic issue for them on that front. So they're willing to be part of a discussion. And I think part of it is for the EU to come to Geneva willing to talk about the climate issues that matter to other countries as well, like around labeling, around fossil fuel subsidies, around greening aid for trade to support climate resilience. There's a set of other issues around circular economy and low carbon issues. And if they can be seen to be part of the dialogue around climate at the WTO, we may have more prospects for advancing or building support for their approach on border measures. I'm just going to quickly say, yeah, I guess the key thing is for the EU, and it would be great if EU civil society and think tanks and others also thought, and national governments also thought about how better the EU can use and engage in the multilateral process as a way of building a broader consensus on sustainability and trade. I think we would really count on the EU being an active player in that respect. I think that's probably all of my 3 minutes.
Super. Thanks, Caroline. It's the thought here was that, you know, it's the better we can also make links between Brussels and Geneva, you know, the more we will be able to make as a community together. So that's also, you know, why we, you know, wanted to also bring Caroline in and, you know, have her listen, and also, you know, do give a bit of a reflection from that side, because also there are, you know, similar webinars have been happening, you know, already in the past, but also in the future in Geneva with Geneva community. So we try and do our best to cross-fertilize basically as well. But we are down to our last minutes, and it has been really great to hear all these rich comments from the panel and you know, really concrete thoughts as to what to do next. I think that's been the really the key value of this morning. Obviously, that also has meant that, you know, we've been kind of trying to rush behind a little bit with the questions from the audience, you know, which we apologize. You know, obviously it'd be much more easier had we had a full half a day somewhere, you know, together in Brussels. But that having that been the case, you know, we do what we can. But before we close, I would, however, like to, you know, to feel like it would be a polite thing to do, hand it over to the panelists very quickly, say, you know, does anybody from the panel have anything that they want to still comment, reflect on, you know, what has been said or suggested as terms of questions? So Neil, Elina, Javier, Anna, and also, you know, Emmanuel, if there's something else you, you know, very quickly would like to, you know, conclude or say, you know, please, please raise your hands or, you know, unmute your mics, and that would be the moment. I see Elina at least unmuting her mic, so I think you might want to say
maybe
something.
Just very quickly, I'd like to thank you for setting up the panel, and I think some of the points about multilateralism and working with the partners in WTO were very pertinent, and of course we will be looking to, when the MC12 does take place, we'll be looking to have some kind of forward-leaning green recovery consistent action incorporated in any possible communications. That's clear. And should there be scope for revitalizing the environmental goods agreement discussions, then we will be the first ones to support that action. That was a clear disappointment for us. Multilateralism is the central plank of all EU action, and you can count on us to continue to defend mechanisms and agreements that are in the heart of it. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Elina. Anna, you are, you know, unmuted, so I think, you know, you also want to say a few words.
Yeah, I just want to say some final remarks. What I really liked about this discussion today is that you brought together also people who don't only work on trade, but also from environment and climate, because I think what is often lacking, I see it also in the NGO scene, but in science and so on, that there's this trade community, and there's really, like, it's very special education, it's a very special mindset, and I think we have to really broaden up this community and include the climate people, the environment people in that discussion, because it's a lot about policy coherence in this field. My really final remark is to remind us all that our internal market and also our trade policy, our economic strength is really one of the big strong tools we have at hand in the EU, and we should really make use of that tool in pushing our environmental and climate goals as well, and it has to go hand in hand together, because otherwise we will never reach the climate goals that were set in the Paris Agreement. Thanks so much for the discussion. I also have to run off now to the next panel, but thank you so much.
Super, thanks Anna, and good luck with the next panel. Thanks for joining us today this morning. Javier, Emmanuel, Niall, anything further, from your side for these last minutes?
Javier, do you want to go first?
As you wish.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. No, just basically to thank you, Marianne, and thanks the organizers of this event, which was very useful for all of us. There are plenty of things that we could have touch upon, but we leave something for the future. We are in touch with Marianne and the Institute, because we are, as Niall said, we are currently undergoing a study on the possible impact of liberalization and trade on biodiversity loss. So we'll continue to be in touch on these issues. I realized that I didn't address the issue of zoonotic origin of the COVID. This is a question which is out there. There has been huge amounts of ink which has been spent on all this lately, but I think what is important here is not to run or not to rush into emotional type of discussions, and have a science-based approach to all the things which are happening, the origin of the disease, what can be done, what cannot be done, and have a well-informed debate. We have a number of tools in the European Union to deal with a number of issues, not the least our cooperation and green diplomacy efforts, but definitely we should not rush into quick conclusions on this particular question. Otherwise, yes, plenty of things to do. A question of resources, definitely, for everybody, for us too. Luckily, yesterday we saw important numbers on the recovery plan announced by the President of the Commission. We'll see how all this plays out in the favor of putting in place the European Green Deal priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Indeed, fingers crossed for getting the resources right to the right places. Niall, a final word is yours, because Emmanuel is saying he needs to rush off as well. So he's saying thank you to everybody and following up about Sam. Niall, okay. Final word, DG Trade.
Past 12. No, I would just remind for people to, because a lot of the discussion was how do we streamline, and discussion about TSD, and that there are very useful provisions in other chapters, like in the energy raw materials chapter on promoting renewable energy and environment impact assessment. So I would suggest having a look and seeing how they feed into the whole discussion.
That's good. Yeah, good point. Thank you for that. So I'll say thank yous from the co-pilot side first, and then I'll hand over to Lisa for the final thank yous. So great thank you to the panelists. Great thank you for all who you send in questions or will line up for questions, and also big apology for all whose questions we weren't able to to bring in to the discussion. We'll learn from that, and hopefully when we will have our next webinar on the topic, we'll see how we can even better organize it, so we'll have questions and more discussion. So we're still learning how to use this space for particularly interactive discussions even better. But I hope you've all learned as much as I've learned today, in terms of more concretely what it means to take this agenda now forward on different fronts, were it climate, were it in the trade department, or were it at the European Parliament, or were it DG Environment, or indeed in Geneva. So with big thank yous, please let's stay in touch. Let's keep on dialoguing, through different ways and means, and also, circulating information on different webinars that might be taking place on this topic. That would be great. So Thank you, everybody, from my side. Over to you, to Lisa, for the very last thank you, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in, for being panel members, for our wonderful moderator and lead author of the study, Marianne. I think, yeah, the existing evidence does indeed demonstrate that much remains to be done when it comes to integrating social and environmental aspects to trade. And improvements are super important because the EU is the world's greatest trading bloc and has therefore a considerable impact that we should not underestimate. And now in the EU, the European Green Deal is at the heart of the recovery from the crisis, and trade should definitely not be an exception, and it should also hold up to the expectations of all the objectives laid out in the European Green Deal. So thank you for this discussion, and I'm looking forward to, yeah, continue debating and working for a better trade regime. Thank you all. And I will close the room in a